When I first moved into Lakeside Glen, I thought the only drama I'd have to worry about was the occasional raccoon raiding my trash cans. I could not have been more wrong. The real threat came dressed in pastel cardigans, blonde bob perfectly sprayed into helmet-like position, and a security badge that she absolutely did not have the authority to wear. Her name was Karen, and according to her, she ran this neighborhood. I discovered this fact only 3 days after closing on my home, when she showed up at my gate at 6:47 in the morning, banging on the metal like she was summoning a medieval guard. When I stepped outside and asked if everything was okay, she proudly announced she needed a key to my gate. Not wanted, needed. I had barely wiped the sleep from my eyes when she began her monologue about community safety, her voice vibrating with the same pitch as an overly demanding smoke alarm. She insisted that as head of the neighborhood watch, she needed access to all gated properties. I asked her what official organization she was part of. She proudly replied that the neighborhood watch was in partnership with the HOA. I reminded her that I was not part of the HOA, and that my house was technically outside their jurisdiction. She froze like a confused robot that had just received a contradictory command. Her jaw dropped hard enough that I swear I heard a crack. She didn't yell. She didn't argue. She just squinted at me and smiled with that tight-lipped expression people wear right before they attempt arson. Then she sashayed away, leaving me convinced I had just made an enemy. I had come here for peace and a quiet retirement-style setup, working remotely and enjoying my private little patch of land near the lake. What I didn't realize was that peace wasn't on the HOA-approved agenda. Later that afternoon, I spotted her walking slowly past my property line, clipboard in hand, writing notes like she was documenting evidence for a criminal trial. I pretended not to notice, but she made sure I did. Whenever she caught me looking, she waved enthusiastically, as if we were best friends and I had just asked her to help plan my birthday. I took that as my official warning that this situation would not magically resolve itself. The gate itself was one of the reasons I bought the place. It was solid steel, ornamented like something from a fancy vineyard estate, and hooked into a strong privacy fence that surrounded the entire front half of the property. A keypad allowed deliveries and invited guests, but the key was only for me. It symbolized independence and safety. I had worked too hard for both to hand them over to a suburban tyrant with control issues. By the end of the week, Karen escalated her effort. She started approaching delivery drivers, grilling them about whether they had the code or whether the gate was blocking essential logistics. She complained loudly to neighbors about how selfish I was installing such aggressive fortifications. When a pair of landscapers mistakenly wandered near the fence line while trimming the shared road's foliage, she treated it like an international conflict. She ran toward them screaming that she needed to inspect their equipment for safety violations. Every passive-aggressive tactic failed, so she pivoted into a more direct approach. One evening, a letter was taped to my gate. It was printed on fancy stationery and filled with legal-sounding nonsense about mandatory community compliance. It demanded that I provide her with a gate key or face procedural consequences. The letter was signed, not by the HOA president, but by Karen herself. I laughed so hard I nearly fell over, though I admit the idea that she would escalate things further left a pit in my stomach. Sure enough, escalation arrived bright and early Saturday morning in the form of 2 local cops. They came to investigate a report of illegal gating and obstruction of community roads. The officers inspected my gate, reviewed my property deed, and quickly realized that Karen had wasted their time. One of them apologized to me while the other tried not to roll his eyes too hard, explaining that this wasn't the first time she had done something like this. As they left, Karen stormed out of her house, protesting loudly about loopholes and unfair favoritism. The cops ignored her. I decided then that ignoring her was no longer enough. This wasn't just a petty annoyance. She wanted control, and she would keep pushing until she got it. I wasn't about to hand her any leverage, so I started planning. If she wanted to fight for control over my gate, I would remove the battlefield entirely. Not by removing the gate. Oh no. I meant making it irrelevant. It began with measurements, survey maps, and a friendly phone call to a contractor I knew from my last job. My property included an old service road on the opposite side, overgrown and hidden behind thick shrubs. With a little cleanup and a new gate installation, that path could become my new primary entrance. I envisioned the look on her face when the original gate, the one she obsessed over like a dragon guarding treasure, suddenly meant nothing. While the contractor scheduled work, I gathered additional documentation to prepare for whatever storm she would inevitably summon. The county land office provided me with a fresh copy of the plat map. The sheriff's department confirmed, again in writing, that my entrance was lawful and within my rights. If Karen wanted a fight, I would legally and quietly win it. But before the change could happen, she gave one last push that nearly tipped me into full war mode. I came home one afternoon to find the keypad ripped off the side of my gate, wires dangling like exposed nerve. There were boot prints in the dirt, and guess who was loitering nearby pretending to water her driveway with a hose? When she saw me, she gave that same tight-lipped smile again and said that the keypad had been acting suspiciously. She claimed she was doing maintenance. I stared at her without saying a word, because if I opened my mouth, I might have said something that would guarantee a lawsuit. That night, staring at the damaged keypad, I knew the battle was escalating faster than expected. She wasn't going to stop because she believed she was entitled to control. She believed order meant she was in charge. The idea of a neighbor living by their own rules was chaos in her worldview. So she wanted to fix that. I was done with defense. It was time for offense. Because if Karen wanted my gate key, she would get nothing but the biggest plot twist this neighborhood had seen in years. And little did she know, the entrance would soon move, leaving her power grab pointless, her plans ruined, and her ego bruised beyond repair. I decided that if Karen wanted control of my gate, I would give her a gate to obsess over, but one that no longer mattered. The thought alone amused me more than it probably should have. After dealing with her tantrum over the keypad, I called the contractor, Ethan, and asked how soon he could start on the alternate entrance. He chuckled when I explained the situation, especially the part about Karen pretending to water her driveway. He promised to move things up on the schedule. By Monday, the crew would be ready. My petty imagination sprinted ahead, visualizing Karen guarding the wrong gate while I casually drove in from a freshly built road she didn't even know existed. It was delicious. Planning the move became my new hobby. I mapped out every detail of how the new entrance would connect seamlessly to the house, bypassing any view from Karen's kitchen windows. The back road, once forgotten, would soon become the main artery of my freedom. Meanwhile, I continued using the front entrance like normal, pretending everything remained status quo. There was something oddly thrilling about playing civilian while plotting infrastructure rebellion. Karen's surveillance intensified. She stationed herself in her front yard like a lawn ornament with a superiority complex, pretending to tend to her rose bushes while keeping one eye locked on my gate. Whenever I walked outside, she shouted passive-aggressive warnings about neighborhood unity and how isolation was bad for community safety. I gave her a polite thumbs up each time. Nothing irritates a control freak more than responding to their rage with complete indifference. Saturday morning, I caught her rummaging near the fence line again. She held her clipboard like a shield when she spotted me. I calmly approached and asked why she was on my property. She insisted she was measuring for emergency vehicle access. I asked her what emergencies she anticipated, and she mumbled something about fires, hurricanes, and general disaster potential. The only disaster here was her personality, but I kept that thought internal. Later that afternoon, the HOA president himself, a middle-aged man named Mark with laugh lines and a weary expression, approached me with an apologetic wave. He explained that Karen had been filing complaints non-stop and demanding that he enforce imaginary regulations. He confirmed what the officers implied earlier. She overstepped constantly. He assured me that my property was not part of the HOA, but he asked if there was any compromise to get her off his back. I told him I was handling the situation, and he looked grateful, not knowing that my version of handling things might cause an HOA legend. Sunday evening brought a new level of absurdity. I heard loud clanking noises outside, and walked out to find Karen with a tape measure and a headlamp strapped to her forehead like a miner inspecting a cave. She was measuring the distance between my gate and the edge of the road. I asked what she thought she was doing, and she announced that she was gathering evidence for a safety report. I reminded her again that she had no authority on my land. She waved her clipboard at me as if it were an official badge of power. Monday morning, the contractors arrived at the back road entrance. Karen noticed immediately. She sprinted over, waving her arms and demanding to know what was happening. Ethan simply smiled and said they were doing permitted work on private property. She stood there stunned, then marched away while muttering like a villain who just had their monologue interrupted. By noon, trees were cleared, brush removed, and the dirt path began to look like a real road again. While the crew worked, I decided to document everything. I filmed every interaction, recorded every strange incident, and saved every threatening letter. Not because I wanted to use it, but because with people like Karen, evidence was a much-needed insurance policy. I also started reaching out to neighbors. I learned she had alienated quite a few of them already. She had ticketed a teenager for reckless bike riding on the sidewalk. She had lectured an elderly couple for using wind chimes deemed auditory clutter. She had even called animal control on someone's poodle for barking twice past 9 p.m. The more stories I heard, the more confident I became that no jury of public opinion would ever side with her. The contractors finished the new road in record time. They installed a beautiful wooden gate facing the quiet back street, complete with a secure keypad and motion light. I stood there admiring the fresh setup, feeling triumphant in a very petty way. The original gate remained untouched at the front, still towering and dramatic, giving no hint that it was now nothing more than decoration. The next day, I drove out using the new entrance for the first time. Karen witnessed the whole thing. She stared like a malfunctioning security robot, frozen mid-glare, as I rolled past with a wave so friendly it bordered on sarcastic art. She immediately ran toward the contractors to interrogate them, but by then they were already packing up. As I drove off, I reveled in the satisfaction of knowing that every ounce of power she imagined she had over my property had just evaporated. When I returned home later, she was waiting. Arms crossed, foot tapping, steam metaphorically bursting from her ears. She demanded an explanation for the new gate. I told her the original one wasn't practical anymore, and since my property rights allowed it, I made the change. She screamed that I was undermining neighborhood order. She insisted that the main entrance needed to be accessible to her as the watch captain. I politely informed her she had no say in the matter. Her shrill voice launched into a monologue about safety protocols and community standards, but I had already walked inside. After she stormed home, I noticed a new letter taped to the original gate. It declared that the neighborhood watch was issuing a citation for obstructing emergency route. The letter threatened escalating penalties. No signature from the HOA. Just Karen. Again. I was almost impressed by her persistence. Almost. That evening, I received a call from Mark. He apologized again and asked if I could attend the upcoming HOA meeting to clear this all up. Technically, I didn't have to, but he sounded desperate. He said Karen was rallying other members, accusing me of being a danger to the neighborhood. I agreed, partly out of amusement, partly to ensure that my version of events was heard before rumors mutated into fiction. As I hung up the phone, I looked out the window. Karen was standing in the dark staring at my new gate like it had personally betrayed her. Her porch light illuminated her face just enough to show pure, unfiltered fury. She wanted that key. She wanted control. And she wasn't done. But neither was I. I knew the meeting would be her grand stage, The moment she believed she could embarrass me publicly and reclaim her imagined authority. People like her thrive on spectacle and the illusion of power. The funny thing was, I had every intention of giving her a show, just not the one she expected. As I prepared for the chaos ahead, I reminded myself to stay calm, document everything, and let her dig her own crater-sized hole. If she wanted war, then she had finally chosen the wrong neighbor. She had no clue what revenge looked like behind closed gates eventually. The HOA meeting was scheduled for Thursday evening in the community center, a beige rectangular building that looked like someone had sucked all joy out of a school cafeteria and left the husk behind. Before heading there, I rehearsed the simple fact. I wasn't in the HOA. My gates were legal. My property was my business. I had all the paperwork neatly printed and tucked into a crisp folder. No need for theatrics. That would be Karen's job. I just needed to stay calm, collected, and factual. People like her always self-destruct when faced with someone who doesn't rise to their bait. As I arrived, I spotted Karen near the entrance wearing a bright red blazer that practically screamed volunteer dictator. She was surrounded by a small group of homeowners, clearly giving an impassioned speech. The moment she saw me, she pointed like she had discovered a criminal mastermind. The group turned and stared. Some looked curious. Others looked tired, like they had seen this kind of performance from her before and wanted nothing more than to collect their free cookies and go home. Inside, rows of metal folding chairs were set up facing a makeshift podium. A long table up front hosted the HOA board members, including Mark. He gave me a sympathetic nod as I took a seat near the back. Karen grabbed the podium before the meeting even officially started. She announced she would be addressing an urgent threat to the community. Her voice was full of triumphant righteousness, like she'd been waiting her whole life for this moment. She launched into her speech, painting me as a hostile recluse with barricades designed to keep out emergency responders and innocent children. She dramatically gestured toward the door, claiming I had installed a fortress portal, hidden deep in the woods to conduct suspicious activities away from community oversight. Someone coughed. Someone else stifled a laugh. Mark finally cut her off and reminded her that the meeting had an agenda. She shook with indignation but sat down, still glaring lasers at me. When it came time for community concerns, she shot up again before anyone else could speak and demanded the floor. Everyone collectively sighed. She tried once more to frame my new gate as a public hazard. I waited until she finished her memorized rant, then calmly walked to the podium. I explained, clearly and simply, that my property was not part of the HOA. I showed the deed, the map, and a signed letter from the sheriff's office confirming my right to manage my own security. The room grew quiet. Karen, on the other hand, shook her head violently while whispering objections under her breath. I did not raise my voice. I did not insult her. I simply laid out reality. When I finished, I thanked the board for allowing me to clarify and returned to my seat. Mark confirmed everything I said, officially putting the issue to rest. He politely asked Karen to stop filing complaints against matters outside the HOA's jurisdiction. Her face contorted into a smile far too wide to be genuine. She claimed she was only doing her duty as protector of the neighborhood. Mark suggested she redirect her protection toward things that existed within legal boundaries. The meeting wrapped up without further drama. As I headed toward the exit, a few neighbors approached me to apologize for her behavior. One older man whispered that she'd tried to make him repaint his mailbox 3 different times due to aesthetic inconsistency. It became clear that Karen's empire of control was built on fear, annoyance, and paperwork harassment, not actual authority. I enjoyed the brief sense of victory all the way home. But when I pulled in through the back entrance, headlights flashed from across the street. Karen stood next to her SUV, arms crossed, staring into the darkness in my direction. She looked like a predator whose prey just slipped out of a trap. I waved again. She stormed inside. The next morning, I woke to a loud metallic banging. I rushed outside to find a city inspector taking pictures of my original front gate. Karen stood nearby, proudly giving a play-by-play explanation about my alleged code violations. The inspector turned toward me and explained that an anonymous complaint had been filed claiming the gate was obstructing a public right-of-way. I pointed out the clearly visible property markers and handed him the same documentation I had shown at the meeting. It took him less than 5 minutes to confirm everything was fine. He left, annoyed that his time was wasted. Karen began accusing the inspector of corruption and favoritism. He ignored her entirely. Later that week, she doubled down. I caught her taking photos of the new back gate too, pacing back and forth like a guard dog sniffing for contraband. She shouted that she would get to the bottom of my covert entrance operation. I told her the only thing covert was her sanity, though I kept that inside my head. Out loud, all I said was that she should probably go home before she accidentally trespassed. She didn't go home. At least, not mentally. Her next tactic involved rallying neighbors to demand transparency about security weaknesses. When that didn't work, she escalated to conspiracy theories. According to her, my new gate was part of a bigger plot. She began spreading rumors that I was storing illegal items or running a business off the book. One neighbor sheepishly asked me if I was keeping wolves. Because apparently, in Karen's head, that was the logical next step for a man with a new gate. I played along. I told him I only kept wolves on Thursdays. He blinked twice before realizing I was joking. Everything escalated again when she tried to physically block my car at the front entrance, standing spread-legged like a traffic cone with anger issues while yelling that I had to explain myself. I simply drove away using the back road. Her shrieks echoed behind me, furious and powerless. Every maneuver she tried, every threat she delivered, every police call she made only further proved that she had lost control. And losing control was the one thing she couldn't handle. Her world revolved around attention, validation, and the illusion that she kept everyone safe through dictatorship-level oversight. The fact that I existed and functioned without her permission was an existential crisis she couldn't process. But then, just when I thought she had exhausted her rampage playbook, she found a new angle. Instead of attacking the gates, she started attacking the road access itself. She argued that the back path connected to an HOA-maintained street and therefore required HOA oversight and approval. Mark called me to warn that Karen was pushing for a vote to classify the private road section near my property as shared infrastructure. That was not going to happen, because, unlike Karen, I actually had the intelligence to read legal documents carefully. I met with a lawyer, showed him everything, and learned something beautiful. The strip of pavement she thought the HOA owned? It wasn't owned by the HOA at all. It was technically a public easement maintained by the county. She had no authority over it whatsoever, and if she pushed her claim hard enough, she might wind up fined for obstruction or harassment. So I let her keep digging. She thought she was coming closer to victory. She thought she was clever, formidable, unstoppable. But she was only building momentum for her own downfall, because while she obsessed over my gates, I was uncovering a secret she had hoped no one would ever discover, a secret about someone who claimed to protect the neighborhood, and had zero legal right to be here in the first place. She wasn't entitled to authority. She wasn't even entitled to live here. I did not go searching for Karen's secret. It practically presented itself like a gift basket left on my doorstep by fate. A few days after the road ownership revelation, I visited the county office to gather more documents, just in case she escalated again. While an employee printed the updated zoning maps, she casually mentioned something odd. She asked how long my neighbor had lived in the area. I assumed she meant Karen and replied vaguely. The employee frowned and explained that the records showed no property registered under Karen's name in Lakeside Glen. I clarified, describing the house, the driveway, the hydrangeas she bragged about constantly. The employee double-checked. Still nothing. The only people recorded as living at that address were the Stensons, a retired couple who apparently owned that home for the last 30 years. My brain paused mid-thought. So if Karen wasn't the owner, then who was she? The employee shrugged and joked that maybe she was a very dedicated house-sitter. I thanked her, grabbed the papers, and walked out, holding on to the mental equivalent of a stick of dynamite. I mulled over the options. Perhaps she was renting? Perhaps she was a relative of the Stensons? None of those possibilities aligned with the way she acted, like a monarch who forged her own crown. If she didn't own the house, she didn't own any power. She wasn't just overstepping. She wasn't entitled to anything she claimed to enforce. Part of me wanted to knock on her door right then and ask her who exactly she thought she was. But confrontation wasn't my style. Patience had served me well so far. And if Karen was hiding something, shining a sudden spotlight would only spook her. I needed clarity, verification, facts that could withstand her shrieking. So I went straight to the source, the Stensons themselves. They were easy to locate. They had a public phone listing with a Florida number. When I called, a frail but warm voice answered. The moment I mentioned the house, the woman perked up. Yes, they still owned it. Yes, they leased it out for short-term corporate stays. They believed a woman named Kara worked in the area and temporarily occupied the property. They paid a service to manage everything and hadn't visited in years. I asked carefully if Kara might instead be named Karen. The woman hesitated, then laughed awkwardly. She admitted they'd never met Kara in person. Everything was handled digitally. She sounded uneasy, suddenly questioning whether she had full understanding of her own tenant. I didn't push. I simply expressed thanks and hung up, my mind now racing with possibilities big enough to fuel a dozen HOA horror stories. If Karen wasn't officially tied to the homeowners, what gave her authority in the neighborhood watch? And who had granted her that badge she flashed around like a sheriff in a Wild West parody? There was only one person who could answer, Mark. I arranged a casual sidewalk chat under the pretense of apologizing for the trouble. When I brought up Karen's position, he sighed long enough to reveal how deeply exhausted he was. He explained that Karen had shown up 3 years ago claiming she was a former law enforcement liaison specializing in community security. She had volunteered, insisted on taking over the neighborhood watch after declaring the previous coordinator unfit. No one checked her credentials. No one questioned that she owned the house. She was confident, loud, and determined. The HOA board, tired of managing petty crime fears, gave her the responsibility just to make her go away happy. She took that crumb of power and cooked an entire feast of authority out of it. Mark rubbed his face like he was internally calculating the hours of sleep he'd lost because of her. He thanked me for handling things so constructively. I told him I was just getting started. As the week progressed, I gathered more pieces of her false identity puzzle. The sheriff's department confirmed she wasn't affiliated with them. A former HOA board member confessed that Karen had once tried to issue speeding tickets using printouts she designed herself on her home printer. A family 2 streets over told me she had once declared a section of the communal park restricted territory until children cleaned up their toys to her standards. If entitlement were oxygen, she had been breathing pure, undiluted arrogance for years. And the entire community had adapted to her behavior like animals habituated to an unpredictable storm. They tolerated her because challenging her seemed exhausting. The thought that she might not even have the right to live there was so absurd and thrilling that part of me wondered if it was too good to be true. People like Karen didn't just lie about their authority. They built it into a fortress. And the bigger the fortress, the harder it falls. One evening, I decided it was time to test her stability. I walked to her front yard casually while she stood proudly watering the sidewalk again. I mentioned that I had recently learned the Stensons owned her house. Her hand froze mid-spray. She denied it with a stutter she tried to disguise as a laugh. She said I must be mistaken. She insisted she had personally negotiated the deed years ago. Her eyes flickered like a projector with a loose wire. I smiled politely and walked away without giving her the satisfaction of a further question. Sometimes silence is the loudest accusation. From that moment she became more frantic. She hovered constantly near the property line. She filed 2 new complaints claiming my front gate now emitted electronic interference into her home. She told neighbors I had hacked the neighborhood Wi-Fi. At one point, she even taped a picture of a wolf to my mailbox labeled evidence. I almost framed it. But then came the night I realized she was unraveling faster than even I anticipated. At 2 a.m., motion lights triggered outside. I checked my cameras and saw her creeping near the back gate, flashlight scanning like she expected to catch me in a criminal act. When I stepped outside and called her name, she bolted like a startled cat. The next morning, she delivered a typed manifesto to several homes warning about my suspicious nocturnal activities. Residents were beginning to roll their eyes in unison whenever she spoke. By this point, she was fighting more than me. She was fighting reality. Authority had been her entire identity, and I had started unplugging every extension cord she'd wrapped around the neighborhood. Still, one loose thread remained. I hadn't yet confirmed whether the property manager knew she was impersonating the owner. That meant there was still more to uncover. And if I exposed her completely, the fallout would be explosive. I contacted the property management company under the guise of asking about neighborhood rental policies. I casually mentioned the tenant of the Stenson home. The representative paused and asked me to repeat the name. When I said Karen, she audibly winced. Then she explained something that sealed Karen's fate. The tenant registered under that lease wasn't named Karen or Kara. It was a man, someone who traveled for work and was only supposed to stay occasionally. Karen wasn't a renter. She wasn't a homeowner. She wasn't family. She was trespassing, squatting, and she had built a kingdom on land that wasn't hers to claim. I thanked the representative and hung up slowly, absorbing the gravity of the revelation. My enemy wasn't just entitled. She was illegally living in a home while declaring herself ruler of the neighborhood. Suddenly her aggression made sense. Control was the only thing keeping her lie alive. If the truth surfaced, everything she built would crumble. But I wasn't going to rush. Timing mattered. Exposure, if done correctly, would ensure she never terrorized another community again. Karen wanted the key to my gate because she believed authority gave her power. But she was about to learn that power built on fraud is one pulled thread away from complete collapse. And I was ready to pull that thread in front of the entire community so no one could ever stitch the lie back together. The next step required finesse. If I handled this wrong, she'd worm her way out with excuses and dramatics. But if I handled it right, she'd be exposed publicly, her entire fantasy regime collapsing under the weight of undeniable truth. I was strangely calm as I prepared. Not gleeful, not angry. Just ready. Her sense of power had become an infection in this neighborhood, and someone had to be the cure. I figured I was already cast as the villain in her mind, so I might as well earn the role with dignity. I organized every document into a neat presentation. The deed, the rental records, the letter from the property managers, and the zoning maps that would snuff out her road access claims like candles in a windstorm. It wasn't revenge. It was justice wrapped in paperwork. That week, I noticed a change in her house. Curtains that once sat perfectly aligned now hung crooked, suggesting frantic peeking instead of perfectly choreographed surveillance. Her grass, usually trimmed with military precision, sprouted uneven patches. The self-declared queen was losing her ability to maintain appearances. She stopped watering the driveway. She stopped pretending her clipboard meant anything. Instead, she paced. Constantly. Her eyes darted toward my back gate every time a car passed, probably terrified I had hired a wrecking crew to demolish her delusions. She even started leaving notes on neighbors' doors begging them to report suspicious shifts in property lines. Each note was more desperate than the last, like manifestos scrawled by a toppled dictator. It was during one of these spirals that she confronted me once more. I was loading groceries from my car when she marched toward me, face twisted into worry instead of rage. Her voice shook as she demanded to know if I had spoken with her landlords. The word landlords sounded foreign in her mouth, like she couldn't stomach the possibility of being anything less than royalty. I asked her what she meant, and she stammered something about routine administrative matters. I told her she might want to get her story straight before continuing. She opened her mouth to yell, but nothing came. For the first time, Karen had no script ready. She walked away fast, almost tripping over her own authority. That night, I drafted a neutral, formal email to the property managers explaining the ongoing harassment and unlawful attempts to enter my land. I attached video footage of her trespassing near the back gate at 2 a.m. I kept my tone professional and objective, letting her actions do the incriminating work. Their reply came quickly. They thanked me for the information and assured me they would investigate immediately. I could practically hear the clicking countdown of her eviction clock. Meanwhile, the neighborhood had begun shifting. People approached me openly now, relieved someone was finally challenging Karen. A mother from down the street thanked me with genuine exhaustion in her eyes. Karen had once lectured her 8-year-old for riding a scooter too joyfully. A man in his 30s admitted Karen had threatened to cite him for storing a kayak too visibly on his own porch. These were normal people who had gradually surrendered their peace to avoid her chaos. They didn't cheer when they heard she might not be legitimate, but their shoulders looked lighter. Oppression, when lifted, doesn't create applause. It creates relief. The breakthrough moment arrived midweek when the property managers requested a video call. They informed me that the authorized tenant, the man whose name was on the lease, had contacted them after realizing his billing was odd. He hadn't been in town for nearly a year and had assumed the house remained empty during his absence. The managers pieced together what happened. Karen had befriended a housekeeper, gained access under the pretense of checking for leaks, and then simply never left. She claimed she was staying temporarily for community outreach, and because the managers oversaw several properties, the lie slid through unnoticed. She was officially a squatter, a sophisticated, cardigan-wearing, clipboard-wielding squatter who had crowned herself security captain of a neighborhood she had no right to even reside in. The managers assured me they were coordinating with the real tenant and local authorities to take action. They asked if I could continue to record any difficult encounters. I agreed. The countdown ticked louder, and Karen sensed it. Her behavior shifted from harassment to pure erratic fear. She left piles of printed warnings around the community warning of outsider threats. She tried to recruit a few of her remaining believers to stand guard near my gates. They didn't. She stood alone, spiraling deeper into paranoia. Then came the night she snapped. I woke to a loud, metallic screech from the front of my property. I pulled up the live feed on my phone and stared in disbelief. There she was, armed with a crowbar, prying open the old front gate keypad box like a burglar in denial. She muttered angrily to herself, as if the gate had personally mocked her. Every yank was a plea for control slipping through her fingers. I grabbed my camera and stepped onto the porch. When she saw me filming, she dropped the crowbar and screamed that she was lawfully investigating critical infrastructure. I calmly reminded her she was tampering with private property. She shrieked that I had pushed her into this, that I had endangered everyone. I told her she needed to go home before she made things even worse. Her breathing grew ragged. She stared like a cornered animal, then stumbled backward and ran off. It was over. She knew it. I knew it. And within 48 hours, everyone would know it. The property managers called with the official news. Eviction notice was served. The real tenant would arrive soon with law enforcement to secure the property. They didn't share the exact timeline, but I didn't need it. The conclusion had already written itself in Karen's unraveling sanity. The day before the hammer fell, she made one final attempt to reclaim her imaginary authority. She knocked on my door just after sunset, speaking through clenched teeth. She demanded a house key now, not just the gate key, insisting that if the roads were compromised during my infrastructure crimes, emergency responders would need access through my home. She claimed she was giving me one last chance to cooperate. I looked her dead in the eyes and told her she had no power here. No claim. No rights. Not even a lease. I told her the truth she had been running from. She didn't belong. Not as a leader. Not as a resident. Not as anything more than a stranger who chose the wrong neighborhood to play tyrant in. Her expression flickered through a gallery of emotions: horror, denial, rage, despair. Then silence. The silence of someone who finally sees the cliff beneath their feet. She turned and walked away without a word, like a balloon that had finally deflated completely. But chaos wasn't finished with her yet. Because eviction wasn't the twist. It was what she did next. The desperate have a way of turning fear into fire. And Karen, stripped of her crown, was about to ignite the kindling she spent years stacking around this neighborhood. Eviction day arrived masked as an ordinary morning. Blue skies. Birds chirping. The kind of peaceful suburban calm Karen spent years pretending she protected. But that calm only made the commotion stand out more when the sheriff's cruiser rolled into the neighborhood with quiet authority. A second car followed, this one carrying the true tenant of the house she had conquered, a sharply dressed man in his late 30s with a rolling suitcase and a look of complete disbelief. I watched from my porch, coffee in hand, as the officers knocked on Karen's door. She emerged with her hair a tangled mess, robe half-tied, and panic visibly pulsing beneath her skin. She tried to slam the door on them. They stopped it with one hand. Her reality finally hit like a brick wall. She screamed that she was the neighborhood watch captain, that she needed to coordinate the eviction to ensure safety. The officers remained unmoved. For the first time, her words held no power over anyone listening. Neighbors peeked from windows, gathering in small clusters at a distance. Karen had become the show. I almost felt bad. Almost. The officers escorted her out as she kicked and shouted that everyone here was in danger. She pointed at me and shrieked that I was the mastermind behind all of this, that I had infiltrated the community to destroy it from the inside. I took another slow sip of coffee. The real tenant looked mortified and apologized profusely to the zone of startled neighbors for the chaos. Karen tried to rush back inside when they brought out the paperwork. The officers blocked her. When she realized there was no winning, the fight turned into sobbing panic. They loaded her into the cruiser. She pressed her face to the window, cheeks streaked with tears, mumbling angrily. Then the car drove away. And just like that, the dictator of Lakeside Glen was dethroned. But the story didn't end there. Karen was not someone who accepted defeat quietly. Losing control broke something in her. And broken people often try to break what's around them. Later that evening, I heard a familiar shriek echoing from the end of the road. She had returned. Not in a car. Not with luggage. Just her and her rage. She stormed down the street screaming profanity at the houses and slamming her fists against mailboxes like a marching tantrum. Neighbors called the police again, but she was already moving toward the one symbol she blamed entirely for her downfall, my old front gate. I stepped outside when I heard the metallic clang of her shoving against the bars. A fire burned in her eyes, scorching through what remained of her composure. She screamed that I had ruined everything. She clawed at the keypad mount she had previously disassembled, ripping at it like a wild animal trying to tear open a trap. When I called out to her, she spun around, pointing at me with pure hatred. She screeched that she had tried so hard to make this place safe, that she deserved respect, cooperation, obedience. I asked her if she ever considered that respect must be earned. She screamed that she earned all of it by keeping chaos away. I reminded her that she was the chaos. Instead of backing down, she charged. It was surreal, like being attacked by a furious pigeon dressed as management. I stepped aside. She stumbled, regained balance, then picked up a loose rock and hurled it toward me with shaky aim. It hit the fence with a loud crack. More neighbors came outside. Some began recording. She realized the lens of public accountability had turned toward her now. Panic flickered across her face. She bolted down the road again, disappearing between two homes like a storm retreating into the woods. Officers arrived minutes later but found no trace. They assured us they'd keep searching. The sheriff himself pulled me aside and advised keeping security high for a few nights. That night, sleep avoided me. Every creak of the house sounded like a warning. Every gust of wind brushing the gate made me check the cameras again. I didn't fear her strength. I feared her unpredictability. When someone loses everything they pretend to be, their actions stop following logic. I stayed awake until dawn, cycling camera feeds and listening for footsteps. Nothing happened. The next day passed quietly too. No Karen. No sign of her anywhere in town. Some neighbors speculated she fled. Others thought relatives came to retrieve her. I tried to believe it was over. Hope is a naive emotion. On the third night, motion lights flared on behind the house. Silence shattered into sharp metallic scraping as someone rammed the new gate from the outside. I grabbed my phone and glanced at the camera feed. Karen. Sweat-matted hair. Wild, sleepless eyes. She held a metal fence post like a battering ram and screamed that she would take down the barrier that ruined her life. She hit the gate again and again, making a dent with each furious blow. I called 911 while stepping outside to keep her in sight. I didn't yell threats or warnings. I only asked what she thought this would accomplish. She shrieked that if she couldn't protect this neighborhood, no one would. Her voice cracked into sobs as she pounded with diminishing strength. By the time the first cruiser skidded into view, she was slumped on the ground, exhausted. Officers approached cautiously. She didn't resist this time. She just cried, begging them not to leave the community vulnerable. They handcuffed her gently and lifted her from the grass. As they walked her away, she swiveled her head back toward me. There was no rage left. Only hollow grief where her ego once lived. The cops assured me she would receive a psychiatric evaluation. I hoped that meant help, not punishment. She needed intervention more than jail bars. When silence finally returned, I stood at the damaged gate and inspected the dent. It would be a simple fix. The psychological dent she left behind would take longer to hammer out. Weeks passed. Life normalized. The neighborhood took a collective breath, relieved that the reign of Karen had ended. People smiled more. Kids rode scooters freely. Wind chimes rang proudly without citations. Even the driveways sparkled less, because no one was forcing unnecessary maintenance schedules. Mark stopped by one afternoon to thank me personally. He admitted he should have questioned her authority earlier. He asked if I'd ever considered joining the neighborhood watch. I smiled and said only if everything came with legal documentation. He laughed, genuinely this time. The real tenant settled into his home properly. He apologized more than he needed to. We shared a beer over the fence and agreed we would both forever keep spare copies of our keys far away from strangers. As for me, I learned something surprising through all of this. Control doesn't make a community safe. Respect does. Not the kind demanded through intimidation. The kind earned through trust. Karen believed safety meant enforcing her will. But safety isn't a fortress. It's freedom without fear. The old front gate still stands. Pure decoration now. A monument to a battle she thought she could win. My real entrance remains at the back, protected by reason, not ego. Every morning when it opens quietly at my command, I feel a small spark of satisfaction. Not in beating her. In restoring balance. Sometimes I look toward the empty house she once occupied. A new family moved in recently. They seem kind. They smile and wave. The house looks like it finally exhaled after years of tension. I doubt they'll ever know how close their home came to becoming a dictatorship headquarters. Occasionally, when the wind shifts just right, I swear I can still hear faint echoes of her favorite line, "I need that key." But now it's only a whisper. A reminder. The gate never made her powerful. the illusion did. And illusions are easy to lock out when you build the entrance somewhere no tyrant thinks to look.